The Boy Who Reversed Himself by William Sleator, Chapter 5. After he left, I sat and thought. Now I could figure out how Omar had collected the information on the note he had left in my locker. Obviously, he had gone into Force Space to examine the contents of Mr. Dixon's desk and had seen his lesson plan for the next day. Sneaky. And he must have been watching me for a while in my room where I pored over my paperwork of Gray's Anatomy and sometimes even wrote out my name, Dr. Laura Abrams, M.D. That was the only way he could have found out I wanted to be a doctor. I was glad I had learned about Force Space and Omar's abilities, and yet I was even more uneasy now than I had been before. He could sneak around outside my field of vision, watching and listening, as good as invisible. He might be watching me right this minute. The idea of it made me horribly uncomfortable. There was only one way I could ever be sure of privacy again. If I was able to go into Force Space myself, then I could check around and see whether Omar was spying on me. And if I was ever going to get Omar to show me the way, then I would have to convince him, more than I already had, that we really were friends. I was more determined than ever now. I began the next day by going over to his house and asking him to walk to school with me. Once again he opened the door only wide enough to squeeze out, preventing me from seeing inside, and he seemed a little embarrassed in my presence. As if he was afraid he'd told me too much about himself. I was a bit edgy too, worrying that Pete might see us together and wondering how I would explain it to him. "Anything you want me to help you out with today?" Omar asked me when we were about halfway to school. I hadn't been saying much, and neither had he. "Help me out?" I said, not sure what he meant. "Well, I guess you know what I can do now. So do you want to know the answers to any homework problems or what the teachers are saying?" "Well, as a matter of fact, there is something I'd like to know," I told him. "Okay, what is it?" "How did you learn to get into Force Space?" He looked away from me. I can't tell you that. I thought we were friends, Omar, and friends tell each other things." "You haven't told me anything about yourself," he said. "What is there for me to tell you? I don't have special powers like you do. I'm just an ordinary person." "You could tell me about any problems you have, like with your family," he said slowly, or if it bothers you being the tallest girl in class, or about Pete." I sighed. Why did Omar have to be so peculiar? No other kid would want to pry into such difficult and personal things. "I thought you already knew all about me from sneaking around and spying where I couldn't see you." "Spying?" he said, as though I had insulted him. "But I wasn't spying, Laura, and I can't read minds. I don't know what your feelings are, and sometimes it's good to talk about your feelings. I'm just trying to help." I did my best to control my irritation. I wanted him to think I was his friend, after all. "Well, I appreciate your interest, Omar, but there isn't time to get into those things right now. We'll be there in another minute." We walked into the schoolyard. It was full of kids, and I felt horribly conspicuous with Omar. Pete and Arlene were not here yet, I was relieved to see, but they would show up at any minute. "Come on, Omar." "You have to help me with my locker," I said, and hurried him into the building. "I can probably figure out the new combination if I look at it from the inside," he said, stopping by the boys' bathroom, "but my locker's over here." "Yes, but I have to go into Force Space from some place where nobody can see me. I'll meet you at your locker." When I got there, the dials on the lock were already turning on their own. A minute later, the lock clicked open. Omar came trotting along the corridor as the first bell rang. "The combination is 4327, he said. "I have to get to my locker now or I'll be late." Pete stopped at my desk before Mr. Dixon called the class to order. "Have a nice walk to school this morning?" he said lightly. "Not particularly," I said with a grimace. "I dropped over to get you, but you'd already left with that Omar jerk." He didn't seem offended, just puzzled and a little disapproving. "I don't get it." "Oh, it's just because he lives next door and my mom feels sorry for him and everything," I explained, trying to keep my voice down so Omar wouldn't hear. Pete shrugged. "Oh, well, anyway, see you at lunch." The final bell rang. And when I emerged from the cafeteria line with Pete and Arlene, there was Omar, sitting at one end of a long, empty table. He smiled faintly at me, then looked away. "Hey, you guys, let's sit over there," I said, unable to sound very enthusiastic. "With Omar?" said Arlene, appalled. "Are you kidding?" "Oh, come on, just this once. Do me a favor," I said. "He's not that bad. He's more interesting than he looks." "So's my brother's pet gerbil. Anyway, what would everybody think? Arlene moved off to a more crowded table. Arlene moved off toward a more crowded table. Aren't you getting a little carried away with this charity business? Pete asked me, not smiling. I don't want to be mean and keep snubbing him all the time, I said. Sure, I'd rather sit with the others. Just do it for me. You know nobody would dare put you down for sitting with him. You mean you're actually going to leave me just standing here and go sit with him in front of everybody? He was angry now, his face flushed. But Pete, I didn't think you would... He turned and waved at somebody and strolled away. He thought I was rejecting him. And what seemed to bother him the most was that I was choosing a pitiful person like Omar with everybody watching. He probably would have preferred me to go and sit with his jock friends. It would have been less demanding. Or would have been less demeaning. I was amazed. It was an effort not to slam my tray on the table when I sat down across from Omar. I was suddenly furious at Pete and Arlene for deserting me. I had never realized how petty and unbending they were. Laura, said Omar softly, you should go sit with them. I don't mind eating alone. Who wants to? I said. If I left him now, I'd be as mean as the others were. Anyway, if they sat with us, we couldn't talk about floor space. And if they don't like it, that's tough. But after school, when I stood at my locker and watched Pete and Arlene walk out of the building together, my stomach sank. I had been hoping for a week that Pete would ask me to the spring dance. Now that didn't seem very likely. I ran into Omar just outside the schoolyard, where he'd obviously been waiting. It was too late now for me to worry about anybody seeing us together. The damage had already been done. He spoke rather flatly, not looking at me, as though he had been planning what he was going to say. Laura, I appreciate what you did at lunch. You were great. I didn't tell him that my motivation had been purely selfish. I wanted to get him to take me into force space. I just thought that's what a friend would do, I said inside. But what's the matter? He said, worried. They forgave you for sitting with me, didn't they? Not exactly, I said. He was so concerned. I had the momentary impulse to lie and tell him that everything was okay just so he wouldn't feel so bad. But I knew he wouldn't believe me. It's just that Pete didn't talk to me all afternoon and now he's gone off with Arlene. Is it because he's jealous? Does he think you're going out with me? He seemed to like the idea. No, Omar, I was pretty sure Pete didn't think anything like that. But, you mean he's still mad at you just because you sat with me in the cafeteria? Omar said, as if he could hardly believe it. I shrugged. I guess so. But that doesn't make sense. Omar slowly shook his head, baffled. Shouldn't he like you for being decent to me? And for not being controlled by what the other kids think? Does he expect you to do just what he wants all the time? You don't understand, Omar, I said, my voice rising. I was angry because I knew Omar was right, and if Pete were a better person, he wouldn't have reacted against me. But I also knew that I wanted to go out with Pete anyway, just because he was so good-looking, and because of the status he would give me. And maybe it was petty of me, but that was how I felt. I'm sorry, Laura, Omar said, and his shoulders slumped. I'm sorry, Laura, Omar said, his shoulders slumping mournfully. I'd do anything to make you feel better. Just tell me how to do it, and I will. It was my chance, and I grabbed it. Take me into force space with you, I said. He stopped walking, the blood drained from his face. Not that. You don't understand. It's dangerous, he said faintly. But you said you'd do anything, Omar, and that's the only thing that would make me feel better. But I'm not allowed to. But what about me, Omar? I said, dismissing his excuse. I didn't worry about what other people wanted me to do when I sat with you at lunch. I just did it because we're friends. And now I'm the one who feels awful, and it's your turn to help me out. But this isn't the same. Please, Omar, I begged him. Here I am asking you to help me, and you keep making these excuses. It's just one little favor, and it means so much to me. That's what friends are for. I'd be so grateful. You'd be one of my best friends forever. Doesn't that mean anything to you at all? It does, Laura, he said in a kind of agony, but... Then take me, Omar. Otherwise, why should I believe you care about me at all? He gazed up at me miserably, standing there on the sidewalk. I do care about you, Laura. It's just that... He glanced away for a moment. He shook his head, then looked up at me again. Well, I could care about you too, Omar, I said, aware that I was leading him on, but too eager to worry about that now. I touched his arm. Please. Well, he closed his eyes, almost as if he were praying. Okay, he whispered and opened his eyes. I'll take you. Oh, thank you, Omar. Thank you so much. I'll never forget this. I mean it. Come on, let's go. But I have to get my equipment first, and we mustn't go there from out here on the street, he said hastily. We have to go from your house. Why? Because if we're inside your house, they won't be likely to notice us, he said, a funny look on his face, and we don't want them to notice us. But there are no other kids around. We could take off from behind those trees. I don't mean other kids, he said. Then who do you mean? The ones out there, he said barely audibly. The force-based creatures. And that is the end of chapter 5.